By April 1945, Hermann Göring's star had fallen far, so far in fact that the number 2 in the Nazi hierarchy behind Adolf Hitler was treated by the inner circle with virtual contempt. Göring had declared that no British or American bomber would be able to attack the Reich, but despite a furious defense and the infliction of massive casualties on the RAF and US AAF, both nations had nonetheless bombed Germany mercilessly. The knock-on effects of Allied bombing further eroded Göring's Luftwaffe as fuel shortages and the lack of trained pilots robbed it of its combat effectiveness, regardless of new and innovative jet and rocket-propelled aircraft. But, curiously, though Göring ended up virtually disgraced in the eyes of Hitler and his cronies, he remained a popular figure to the German people. Fat Hermann, as they called him, was the only Nazi leader to laugh at himself. He was essentially a ruthless man of extremely high intelligence, making him probably the cleverest of all the top Nazis. And a clever man like Göring had no intention of being dragged down with Hitler when the inevitable end of the war arrived. He was, ever since his days, commanding the Red Baron's old squadron in World War I, a survivor. Göring had last seen Hitler in Berlin on the 20th of April 1945, on the occasion of the Führer's 56th and last birthday. Göring, along with the other Nazi leaders, had attended a reception in the bomb-battered new Reich Chancellery and a military briefing afterwards. The situation was, to say the least, bleak. The Red Army had just reached the eastern suburbs of the city following a 3-day battle for the Seelow Heights, 90 kilometers east of Berlin. The Germans were preparing to defend the Reich capital street by street, house by house. It was hoped that Hitler would see sense and fly south to his home at the Obersalzberg in southern Bavaria before the Soviets finally encircled Berlin. But he remained undecided and still trying for a last-minute victory. Göring had decided to save whatever of his treasures as he could from Carinhall, his huge mansion north of Berlin, and send them by train to Obersalzberg, where he had another house close to Hitler's. Huge amounts of paintings, china, silver, carpets and tapestries, statues, and his own vast collections of uniforms, clothes and medals chugged their way south on heavily protected Luftwaffe trains. The situation in the west was no better than in the east. British forces were fighting into northern Germany, while central and southern Germany were being overrun by the Americans and French. Preparations had already been made for the destruction of Carinhall. As soon as he could, Göring left Berlin, arriving with his wife and daughter, household staff and escort unit at Obersalzberg on the 22nd of April 1945. Late that night, a message arrived from Berlin. The message from General Karl Koller, chief of the air staff, was garbled, but reported that Hitler had suffered a nervous collapse and planned to die in Berlin. Göring ordered Koller to fly to Obersalzberg and brief him immediately. General Koller arrived at noon on the 23rd of April. He explained that General Eckhard Christian had telephoned him from the bunker on the 22nd of April and demanded to see him in person immediately. Christian arrived and told Koller, "The Führer has collapsed and says it's pointless to fight on. He's staying in the bunker and will defend Berlin to the last and then do the obvious." Confirmation of this news was given to Koller by Colonel General Alfred Jodi, the Army Chief of Staff, who had been at the meeting when Hitler had gone berserk. When the generals had asked what would happen next about leadership for the Reich, Hitler had only replied that Göring should negotiate with the Allies, as he was better suited to the task. Jodi had suggested that Hitler should swing all of the Western armies around against the Soviets, but the Führer rejected this, saying, "The Reichsmarshal will have to do that." Reichsmarshal Göring, as Hitler's named and legal successor, sent for Dr. Hans Lammers, a senior civil servant at the Obersalzberg, and the files relating to the succession. He also ordered flak and SS defences around his house increased. Dr. Lammers explained the succession. Göring suddenly saw that all his previous disgrace would be undone by taking charge of the Reich at its bleakest hour and negotiating with the Western Allies some form of negotiated peace. Lammers was uneasy. Hitler was, after all, still alive. However, Göring read out the first line of Hitler's decree. It said, "In the event that I am impeded in the discharge of my duties by sickness or other circumstances, even temporarily, I denote as my deputy in all my offices the Reichsmarschall of the Greater German Reich, Hermann Göring," dated 29th of June 1941. The second decree directed that immediately after Hitler's death, Göring was to have both government and party resworn in his name. Legally, was Hitler trapped in his bunker in Berlin de facto dead? General Koller urged Göring to clarify the situation with Hitler. At 3 p.m. the 23rd of April, Göring sent a very carefully worded radiogram to the bunker. It read, "Mein Führer, acting upon information furnished by Generals Jodi and Christian, General Koller has today given me a version of events, according to which, in the context of certain deliberations you made, referred to my name, underlining that if negotiations should become necessary, then I would be better placed to conduct them than you in Berlin. These statements were so startling and serious in my view that I shall consider myself duty-bound to infer that you are no longer a free agent, if I do not receive an answer to this by 10 p.m. I shall thereupon consider the conditions of your decree as satisfied, and act for the good of nation and fatherland. May God protect you and see you through. Your faithful Hermann Göring." Göring also radioed Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the Army High Command, ordering him to fly from Berlin to Obersalzberg if by 10 p.m. that night he was no longer getting direct orders from Hitler. "A government must be in existence if the Reich is not to fall apart," said Göring. Similar instructions went to Reich Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop. But Hitler had in the meantime recovered his composure. Göring's messages arrived in the bunker straight into the hands of his enemy, Party Secretary Martin Bormann. He quickly sought to discredit and remove Göring. Placing the radiogram before Hitler, he declared them high treason. Hitler read them and ordered Göring arrested at once for attempting to replace him. Bormann moved quickly. He radioed Grand Admiral Dönitz, commanding German forces in the north of the country. "Urgent, on Führer's orders. Reich government is not to fly to Bavaria. Prevent flight from Holstein, move like lightning, block all airfields." Next, Bormann contacted SS Obersturmbannführer Frank, commanding the SS garrison of the Obersalzberg, and ordered him to arrest Göring and Lammers immediately. 85 SS moved to surround Göring's villa. Hitler replied to Göring, writing, "Decree of June 29, 1941 takes effect only when I specifically authorize. There can be no talk of freedom to act. I therefore forbid any step in the direction you indicate." Göring realized, to his horror, that he was now finished. At 8 p.m. his phone line was cut. At 10 p.m. Frank entered the villa, saluted Göring and announced, "Herr Reichsmarschall, you are under arrest." Göring was furious. Bormann sent a message promising that his life would be spared if he agreed to resign from all of his offices for reasons of ill health. Göring complied immediately. He was, after all, still a Reichsmarschall. 24 hours later, the Royal Air Force attacked the Obersalzberg. The Allies had finally decided to attack the Obersalzberg, though the purpose of the raid remains unclear. Hitler was in Berlin, and this information was known through ultra-signals decrypts of Enigma traffic. But there was a genuine fear among the Allies that he might yet fly south to the Berghof, his private home, and direct the war from there. So, on the 25th of April, just 12 days before the German surrender, 16 RAF Mosquito Pathfinder planes guided in 359 Lancaster bombers. By way of comparison, this is the same number of planes that the RAF had used 10 days previously to devastate the large German city of Kiel. As air raid sirens wailed and flak guns opened up, Göring tried to flee to the extensive tunnels beneath his villa, but was forced back at gunpoint by the SS. When a second wave of British Lancasters approached, the terrified SS guards finally herded Göring, his family and staff into the freezing tunnels. In the meantime, the Göring house was flattened. For several days, Göring and his family and staff remained under guard in the tunnels. Ominously, Bormann sent out another radiogram to Colonel Frank from the besieged bunker, ordering him to kill Göring if Berlin fell. However, on the 25th of April, SS Standartenführer Ernst Brauser of Reichsführer SS Himmler's legal staff arrived. The next day, a new SS unit took over. Göring was separated from his military staff. Himmler had skillfully extracted Göring from Bormann's clutches. A live Reichsmarschall might prove a useful card in the near future. After all, Himmler was up to his own intrigues behind Hitler's back, negotiating with the Western Allies through Sweden. With his house at the Obersalzberg destroyed, Brauser asked Göring where he would like to be held. He suggested Mautendorf Castle in Austria. Göring had spent part of his childhood at Mautendorf Castle, as his mother was the long-time mistress of the medieval fortress's wealthy Jewish owner. In 1939, Göring had actually inherited the building, located 40-odd miles from Obersalzberg. Early on the 28th of April, Göring climbed into his armoured Mercedes with his wife and daughter. Escorted by an SS platoon in trucks, they drove to Mautendorf. Göring quickly returned to his usual luxurious lifestyle. He had a fairly convivial time with Colonel Brauser, sharing wine and cigars. Brauser visited General Koller a day after their arrival. "You know, Göring's a splendid fellow," he said. "I won't do him any harm." On the 30th of April, Brauser showed Göring a signal from the bunker. "Shoot the traitors of April 23rd if we should die." It was the first time that Göring had seen Bormann's original message to kill him. On the 1st of May came the announcement of Hitler's death in the bunker, which had actually occurred on the 30th of April. Colonel Brauser telephoned Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the Luftwaffe officer commanding southern Germany, and asked him whether he should now execute Göring in accordance with Hitler's wishes. Kesselring advised him not to. But the Reich Marshal was not to be released. With Hitler dead, the disgraced Göring still felt that he could bring about an end to the war if he could meet with General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander in Europe. On the 4th of May, Göring sent his personal doctor to General Koller, who passed the request up to Field Marshal Kesselring, who passed it by radio to Grand Admiral Dönitz, Hitler's new successor as Reich President in northern Germany. No reply came from Dönitz, who was having enough trouble sidelining Heinrich Himmler at his headquarters. Himmler's secret negotiations had also been discovered before Hitler had died, and like Göring, the Reichsführer SS had been stripped of his officers and officially disgraced. And like Göring, he believed he was the man to negotiate with Eisenhower. The story goes that later on the 4th of May, a passing Luftwaffe unit discovered Göring at Mautendorf Castle. They liberated him from the SS. Well, that's the story. In reality, Brauser and the SS saw no real point in killing Göring now that Hitler was dead, and surrender was clearly only a few days away. In reality, Field Marshal Kesselring on the 6th of May ordered Brauser to stand down. The SS cleared off, freeing Göring to begin movements to become the man of the hour. He instructed General Koller to contact the Americans. "I, as Germany's most senior general," he said, "must be sent to meet Eisenhower. I am the most popular of our generals, particularly in the United States." Göring also sent a radiogram to Grand Admiral Dönitz offering to handle negotiations with the Allies. Göring knew that he needed to contact the Americans at once. He therefore sent Oberst Bernd von Brauchitsch, his military aide, in his armoured Mercedes, bearing 2 letters to what he called Marshal Eisenhower and U.S. Army Commander General Jacob Devers. he suggested a meeting be held at Fishhorn Castle. The day before, the reconnaissance platoon of the 635th Tank Destroyer Battalion, US 36th Infantry Division, was 6 miles south of Bad Tölz in Bavaria. That afternoon, whilst patrolling, they received a radio message. All companies. German Army Group G has surrendered, effective 1200, 6th of May 1945. All units halt in place. Do not fire unless fired upon. They were asked to come in. They turned their lights on and drove in to Kufstein, just across the border in Austria. Göring's aide, Colonel von Brauchitsch, had made it to the American lines. When the 36th Infantry Division realized that Göring was in contact, a plan was formulated on the spot to bring him in. Assistant Division Commander Brigadier-General Robert Stack would drive behind German lines to make the rendezvous at Fishhorn Castle and escort the valuable prisoner back to US lines. He needed an escort of his own. Not much could be spared on such short notice. On the morning of the 7th of May 1945, Stack departed in his Plymouth staff car, following von Brauchisch's Mercedes. The escort consisted of 1st Lieutenant Robert Sill and 5 jeeps and 2 M8 armoured cars from the 636th Tank Destroyers Reconnaissance Company, and 2nd Lieutenant Jack Shapiro and half a dozen of his men from the 142nd Infantry Regiment's Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon, mounted in 2 jeeps. In total, 11 vehicles and just 24 men. The war was still on, and it was a risky business. The distance from Kufstein to Fishhorn was 52 miles. The reason why the mission was mounted with such haste was a fear that Göring might change his mind and attempt to escape instead to Switzerland, or that the Soviets, rapidly advancing into Austria, might grab him instead. Stack's little task force passed German units in fields, parking vehicles, bringing up artillery pieces, and attending to their kit. Many were self-propelled guns. Some of the Germans saluted the Americans as they drove past. The Americans turned the M8's turrets to the rear and elevated their guns to show that they were not a threat. As the convoy of vehicles climbed up the Turn Pass, which stands over 4,000 feet, the M8 armoured cars were left behind by the cars and jeeps. At each intersection they found a German soldier with a rifle slung. General Koller had sent men ahead to secure the route. Arriving at Fishhorn Castle without incident, Stack's little task force had the shock of its life as they drove their vehicles into the castle's courtyard. It was swarming with SS, who were armed to the teeth. In fact, Fishhorn Castle was the headquarters of the Florian Geyer Cavalry Division. The division's chief of staff and senior officer at Fishhorn was SS Standartenführer Waldemar Fegerlein. Incredibly, his brother, SS Brigadeführer Hermann Fegerlein, had been Himmler's SS liaison at Führer headquarters. Incidentally, he was also married to Eva Braun's sister, Gretel. Attempting to slip away from the bunker towards the end of the Battle of Berlin, Hermann Fegerlein had been discovered, arrested, and later executed on Hitler's orders after Himmler's treason had been discovered. The SS at Fishhorn Castle numbered about 50 to 60 men, and they largely ignored the Americans. They remained in the courtyard buildings and the stables and not in the castle itself. As for Göring, he was nowhere to be found. In fact, the Reichs Marshal was still at Mautendorf Castle when General Stack reached Fishhorn. An irate General Koller phoned Göring and said, "You asked for that rendezvous, now keep it." Göring, in a disgruntled mood, organized his family and staff into vehicles for the drive to Fishhorn. As well as his wife and daughter, the party included Göring's 2 sisters, his wife's 2 sisters, and 2 nieces. Also travelling in the group was SS Obergruppenführer und Reichsleiter Philipp Bühler, chief of the Chancellery of the Führer, who was accompanied by his wife, as well as General der Infanterie Franz Ritter von Epp. including aides, drivers, servants and secretaries, in all 30 men, women and children in a limousine and a Luftwaffe bus were travelling west. But the roads were jammed with refugees fleeing the advancing Soviets and discharged soldiers wandering about, making progress extremely difficult. The Americans decided that a second mission would be launched to locate Göring's party after a report reached Fischhorn that Göring was stuck in traffic near Rastatt. Refugees recognized Göring, who was travelling in a new, simplified uniform more in fitting with the late war situation he found himself in. In contrast to what was later reported, and also often appears in history books, Brigadier-General Stack stayed at Fischhorn Castle and did not drive forward. Instead, Second Lieutenant Shapiro went in Stack's Plymouth, escorted by his own men in 2 jeeps, to find Göring and bring him in. At Fischhorn, the Americans had reached an agreement with Colonel Fegelein. Sentry posts were established that consisted of 1 GI and 1 SS trooper, both armed. Shapiro's mission was a success. He found Göring's party stopped beside the road. The first thing Göring said on being captured was perhaps indicative of his attitude to leadership in the Third Reich since 1933. 12 years. I've had a good run for my money. At 11:30 p.m. on the 7th of May 1945, Shapiro escorted Göring's party through the gates of Fischhorn Castle. On seeing SS at Fischhorn, Göring was afraid. Meeting Brigadier-General Stack, he asked, "When do I get to meet Eisenhower?" Stack deflected the question, but Göring persisted, telling Second Lieutenant Shapiro, who was translating, "Ask General Stack whether I should wear a pistol or my ceremonial dagger when I appear before Eisenhower." "I don't care 2 hoots," snapped back Stack. Göring was escorted to his quarters for a bath before dinner. Afterwards, he once more donned his powder blue uniform and posed for photographs in front of the Texas flag, as the 36th Infantry Division was from the Lone Star State. Before turning in, Göring asked to retain 4 MP-40 machine pistols for his personal protection, still unsettled by the presence of SS. Stack agreed, and Göring's adjutants armed themselves. Before going alone to his room, Göring said to his wife, "I've formed a good impression of Stack. Perhaps I can still do something to help Germany." But the Americans had other ideas regarding Hermann Göring. The next day, Göring, dressed once more in his plain Luftwaffe uniform and forage cap, was separated from his wife and party, and accompanied by Colonel von Brauchitsch and General Stack, driven to the 36th Division headquarters, now located at Kitzbühel, for a meeting with Major General Dahlquist, the divisional commander. At this stage, Göring was still armed. Göring entered the 36th headquarters and the Grand Hotel. Dahlquist saluted Göring and then invited the Reichsmarschall to a lunch of chicken, potatoes and peas served in mess tins. The conversation afterwards was convivial. During the fireside chat, Göring told the American generals that Hitler had been narrow-minded and ignorant, von Ribbentrop was a scoundrel and Rudolf Hess an eccentric. But higher authority was not impressed by Göring's red carpet treatment. On the 9th of May, Göring was escorted to a small airstrip at Kitzbühel, the Americans having decided to fly him to the 7th Army headquarters at Augsburg in Germany for debriefing. The problem was Göring's weight. The American pilot, Captain Beau Foster, took one look at the Reichsmarschall, who at that time weighed over 260 pounds, and knew he would never get airborne in his Piper L4 spotter plane. An upgrade was hastily found, a Piper L5 that Foster had little experience of flying. Captain Foster would be alone with Göring for the 55-minute flight. They chatted in broken English and German during the journey, Foster later telling his wife that Göring was effeminate and gave him the creeps. On landing, Foster received an interesting souvenir. He asked his passenger to sign a blank flight report. Hitler's number 2 wrote, "Hermann Göring, Reichsmarschall." Loaded aboard a jeep, he went to the headquarters. After Colonel von Brauchitsch had arrived by road, Göring was escorted into a small room and told to surrender his firearm. ironically an American-made Smith & Wesson revolver, and take off all his medals and decorations, leaving only his Reichsmarshal's epaulets. It is evident from Göring's expression that he hadn't expected such treatment. On the 11th of May, Göring, dressed once more in his pale blue uniform, also stripped of decorations, was paraded before 50 Allied newspaper reporters in a controversial press conference. Orders arrived soon afterwards that Göring was to be treated as a war criminal, and soon afterwards he was moved to Camp Ashcan in Luxembourg to be prepared for trial at Nuremberg. You may be wondering what happened to all of Göring's art and private property that he shipped to Bavaria from Carinhall. The trains were discovered in tunnels and sidings at Berchtesgaden station by French and American troops. Locals had already partially looted them, and some of the treasure still remains missing today. What remained was put on display in Berchtesgaden by the US Army. As for Hermann Göring, he stood trial at Nuremberg, was sentenced to death, but cheated the hangman by killing himself the night before his execution in his cell. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share, and also visit my audiobook channel, War Stories with Mark Felton. You can also help support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon. Details in the description box below.